I'll be talking more today about corridors. Once again, thanks to the Sheffield Global Corridor Research Team, our partners and collaborators and researchers in various parts of the world. In the last lecture, I problematized the idea or the notion of the corridor, thinking through histories of the dynamic and dialectical relations between global trade, urban settlements, and technology, the longer histories of the term in the planning and social sciences, is contemporary proliferation across various planning regimes in which different types of corridors represented in this typology demonstrate, or at least I argued, the global pervasiveness of corridorization logics. Today, I want to hold on to that relational understanding of the term and its multiple articulations, but also draw on our global corridor project focus on the infrastructure corridor, which I argue has two key characteristics. One, that it crosses borders, it's a cross-border, incorporating various kinds of territories, cities, countries, regions, towns, hinterlands, and such like. And secondly, that the corridor itself is multimodal, a bundle of different kinds of infrastructure that come together into a bigger whole, some of which I went through last week and will return to next time. I also want to introduce the idea of lines of inquiry today to think about corridor urbanisation as a research agenda or theoretical orientation, and I'll be coming back to this more shortly. So the lecture's split up into a number of parts. I'll outline these various lines of inquiry that make up the idea of corridor urbanisation as a loose theoretical orientation. They include thinking about the time of the corridor, arguing we now live in an era of such infrastructural reordering, a global space and geography of the corridor, in which we can demonstrate in detail how regions of the world are being restructured, the infrastructural space of a corridor is critical to our interrogations in thinking about the technologies at play, and the subsequent urban space and geographies of the corridor that are produced in its planning, making, operation, and experience. Collectively, I think such a focus offers one particular pathway in which to think about these techno-territorial constellations in a transforming planet. Let me begin with the moment in which we live in, an era in which we witness the corridorization of massive new territorial delineations as arguably the primary driver of spatial ordering across urban regional space. This idea to focus on temporality and time draws on the calls for emphasis on the temporalities of infrastructure developed by scholars such as Addy, Glass, Nels, and others. So, the time of the corridor. In work with Elia, Han, and Alan, we focused on the Belt and Road Initiative as the primary driver of the corridorization logics across the planet. As China's Belt and Road Initiative moves into its second decade, it became a highly visible and at times contentious international cooperation and economic strategy, intersecting and influencing planetary presence and futures. Announced in 2025 by Chinese President Xi Jinping, the BRI has heralded as the single largest infrastructure project since the post-World War II Marshall Plan, with a scope and scale perhaps unprecedented in modern history. The massive investments associated with BRI projects continue to expand across ever-growing territories of logistical circulation, with diverse new construction activities proceeding rapidly. From Kenya to Nepal, Jamaica to Kazakhstan, the BRI is often the dominant factor in investment inflows, leading to localized material transformation, as well as planetary and global restructuring. Now, the BRI origins are often attributed to two overlapping interpretations. Firstly, through an economic logic, in which the government of the People's Republic of China responded to the 2008 global financial crisis with a state-funded economic stimulus package. This supported the large-scale reorganization of accumulation regimes and led to the exporting of China's so-called construction boom in the 2008 period. This response to the crisis also coincided with China's existing and ongoing major regional development initiatives, such as the Great Western Development beginning in 1999, the Northeast Area Revitalization since 2003, and the rise of Central China since 2006. The construction boom from these earlier periods resulted in major oversupply and excess productive capacity in industrial and construction sectors, and the gradual decline in demand, also, of course, linked to the 2008 financial crash in the EU and the US, which eventually led to a contraction of China's exports. In light of these developments, the BRI has been understood, in the words of Harvey and others, as a major spatial fix to capital's over-accumulation crisis in China, due to its potential to revitalize economic growth by facilitating geographical expansion and spatial reorganization. Secondly, we can think of the BRI as a geopolitical logic. It's in China's strategic interests and its attempts at realigning global markets and international relations away from the dominance of the US and its power in shaping the contemporary global order over the last few decades. This sits alongside a more longue durée perspective in which we can argue the BRI is understood beyond the immediate China-US relations, but also part as a wider shift in global economic geography away from centuries anchored in the North Atlantic and towards the Pacific Ocean. In this geopolitical reading, the BRI can be understood as an attempt or scramble over network centrality, i.e. the logistics, production and telecommunication network that some have called the Second World War, in which Chinese-financed transnational projects signal the rise of a new world power. And you can find more about this idea of the Second World War, through the Second World War Observatory run by Seth Schindler and others. So Elia, Han, and Alan and I argue that despite the notion of creating this continuous surface as implied by the term belt, the movement of capital, goods and people instigated through the BRI primarily occurs through corridors within and between key nodes, with strategically located flagship projects in selected cities, even as these projects move beyond these proximate urban areas into extended territories of operation, including rural hinterlands. As evidenced by the BRI's vision document, the allocation of investments and a significant body of academic, policy and journalistic analysis, the BRI has become a global catalyst of extensive material transformation. It transcribes new corridors linking regions and reconfiguring existing cities into trade, financial and tourist hubs, producing entirely new cities in the making. The BRI introduces novel combinations of large-scale infrastructure projects alongside industrial projects and significant investments across multiple economic sectors. These, as we explored last week, encompass railways, roads, waterways, airports, ports, industrial parks, manufacturing zones, special economic zones, fibre optic telecommunications, as well as investments such as smart cities, greenfield investments, real estate developments, agribusiness and commercial projects. And they do so through bundling them together in these multimodal cross-border networks that we understand as corridors. In our work, we find it useful to highlight three particular types of BRI-led territorial restructuring that convey why we pay close attention to how the planet is being transformed. So firstly, the BRI has organized in direct relation to sinocentric regional and global production networks in which investments in the built environment and infrastructure are directly territorial connected into and integrated into China's economy. And this has proceeded through the BRI's 6 main international economic corridors, namely the new Eurasian land bridge, the China-Mongolia-Russia corridor, the China-Central Asia-Western Asia corridor, the China-Indo-China Peninsula corridor, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and the Bangladesh-China-India-Myanmar corridor, as well as their various offshoots. Additionally, this direct connectivity created by these corridors creates new types of cross-border, urban and regional spaces, such as the Muse Border Economic Zone in Myanmar and its connected Chinese city of Ruli as part of the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. So studies focused on this type of BRI-led restructuring of territory highlight the ways in which economic growth, both inside and outside China, become entwined and intensified through these investments. They connect to longer and broader shared histories that I spoke about in depth in Lecture 1, and these territorial restructurings also are taking place far beyond China's borders. For instance, the German city of Duisburg has rapidly transformed into one of the key logistical hubs in Europe for its connection to Chongqing in southwest China via the Chongqing-Xinjiang EU Transnational Railway Corridor. Secondly, we think about this territorial restructuring through indirect connections. So these are connections that don't have land connections with China, but remain integral to logistical network expansion upon which the BRI vision and plan are established. So think here about regions such as Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America. And these investments too are often part of large-scale cross-border infrastructure corridors financed through various Chinese state-owned enterprises and incorporating lots of different kinds of territorial restructuring. Thirdly, and finally, BRI projects have spilled into various initiatives, investments, and projections with planetary ambitions across diverse spaces, scales, locations that offer this third form of territorial restructuring. So these include digital Silk Road, polar Silk Road, space Silk Road. Ambitions by China are also generating other kinds of corridors. So we can think here about the digital Silk Road involving infrastructure investment across multiple locations, but also the broader restructuring of digital space through and by digital corridors, in which new forms of digitization and a global vision for dominance of ICT sectors allows this kind of investment to proceed. So thinking about the BRI, I think there's two things I want to re-emphasize in this talk today. One is the focus on the territorial restructuring being planned and operationalized by the BRI, in which the focus or locus of this development is the urban regional space. The second is thinking about the idea of connectivity or interconnectivity, in which the BRI engenders new kinds of connections in which the corridor remains paramount as a technology in which to export these models. So let me be clear though, it's not just China and the BRI that are pushing the corridorization logic across the planet. There are a range of global, regional, national initiatives shaping new plans for multiple different corridors that we begin to document over the last few years of our project. Some of these corridor initiatives overlap with the larger BRI 6 corridors, but have longer histories that precede the initiative. Some of them are in direct competition with China through increasingly strategic attempts by the EU and the US to address concerns that the BRI is restructuring the global economy and its logistical and production networks into China's economic orbit. Again, I make clear the corridor is the critical technology for this global infrastructure race. Let's look, for instance, at the CARET corridors, an initiative of the Central Asian states to improve regional connectivity and intermodality. The initiative is set up in 2001, is funded by the EU up to 2009. At this stage, it's very much a set of linear railway corridors developed in the post-Soviet attempts to integrate the region into Europe's sphere of influence and economic circuits. However, it has evolved and has gradually been incorporated into new Asian funding regimes, such as the Asian Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and later, after 2013, the BRI and its various financial mechanisms that produce a new set of carrot corridors that are far more dense in their networks and with multiple different kinds of investments. For more than 2 decades, and again, preceding the BRI, the 6 countries of the Greater Mekong sub-region have been working together under an economic cooperation programme to realise their vision for a prosperous, integrated and harmonious sub-region. Established in the late 1990s, the economic programme has increasingly been shaped around the corridorisation logics that characterise the Chinese model of export-led development. Again, railways, ports, roads, zones, industrial production, and so forth, bundled together into corridor. So the initiative has its roots preceding the BRI, but it's increasingly been incorporated into the plans and investments emerging from Chinese cooperation in its main corridors, particularly the nearby and overlapping CICPEC, with the Greater Mekong sub-region now planned around 3 major economic corridors: the north-south, the east-west, and the southern economic corridors. So here we have a story like CAREC, in which long-standing corridor plans are intensified and expanded through the BRI, but also sit as distinct initiatives with regional and national governance heavily involved. I spoke last week about the IMEC, India, Middle East, Europe corridor, as a massive new investment and perhaps the main approach by the US and Europe to countering the BRI. But it's not the only example in which we can see these US attempts to try and wrestle back control of the corridor from China and the BRI. The Labutu corridor has been heralded as Washington's answer to the Belt and Road by the media, not myself, a 1,300-kilometre railway traversing Angola, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Zambia. And it's definitely been driven by concerns in the US about Chinese dominance over mineral extractions in the region. The corridor seeks to secure resources primarily in the DRC, but also provides an alternative export route for the Zambian copper belt, in direct competition to the Chinese finance and supported Tazara Railway and its route to the port of Dar es Salaam. Announced in October 23 at the EU Global Gateway Forum, the project brings together the US, the European Commission, the African Development Bank, the African Finance Corporation, and national governments. Here we can see how the global infrastructure race is playing out through the planning of corridors. Again, as the folks at the Second Cold War Observatory would argue, a competition for network centrality that is driving ever more proposals for these multimodal cross-border initiatives. So what I hope I've demonstrated is that a critical part of a developing theoretical orientation through various lines of inquiry require thinking from a temporal perspective. Doing so means acknowledging we are living in an era of a corridor, at least according to the consultants, planners, government officials, politicians, and other stakeholders that are driving these initiatives. And this is characterized by intensifying efforts to plan, finance, construct, operate, and control these vast and extended corridors, a corridorization logic at the heart of our contemporary world. So I now want to move on from this temporal line of inquiry to think spatially, and first at a global level. We're busy in the project at the Urban Institute and alongside our design and tech team of Dan and Tom in developing our global corridor atlas. The atlas will visualize a planetary-wide new geography being shaped through the contemporary proliferation of these corridors. And we've looked at over 74 separate corridors that span 97 countries across the globe, accounting for what we might estimate over $3 trillion of planned investment. We designed the atlas as a visual and data-led method to collate and represent thousands of data points and locations we've collected over the last few years. Mapping, we would argue, provides a powerful foundation for us to think spatially as well as statistically about why, how, and with what implications the corridorization logic is transforming the planet. In our attempt at making the atlas, our purpose has been to develop a new way to see and to hopefully understand these corridorization logics at work at a global level. Today, I'm going to show you a first iteration of our developing atlas. So we started by shortlisting corridors that are both cross-border and multimodal. The list isn't complete given the often opaque ways in which corridors are represented. We then start to bundle these corridors into different regions. Here you can see the work by Yanis looking at the 10T network in Europe, accounting for over $720 billion of investment in transit networks across the continent. You can see a partial list of our African corridors, accounting for nearly $300 billion of investment. And I'm going to focus particularly today to show you through the atlas and begin to draw out some of the major themes coming out of our work, the East African corridors that are the highlighted yellow ones, but also Dar es Salaam corridor not highlighted. So later next year, we'll launch this online atlas. Today, I'll just take you through the East African component to give you a little idea of how it works and some of these emerging trends. So, as I argued in the last lecture, the corridor is not quite the linear passageway that we imagine it to be. Here you can see the 6 corridors of the East African region that really look like a mess. They're quite difficult to map in any kind of way, but we might here think about the corridor as a kind of networked bundle of infrastructures, as well as these more linear routes. So we focus on mapping individual corridors themselves, such as the Nacala corridor, here about 8.8 billion of investment in various different infrastructures. So what we've tried to do is pull out each of these different infrastructures that make up a corridor. So for Nacala, you can see it's rail and road projects, port improvements, special economic zone, coal mine and coal terminals. In Lapset, you can see various phases of the port of Lamu. You can see the Lamu-Risolio road, crude oil pipeline that's being proposed. So what's really interesting in the database and the atlas is, again, the temporal dimensions of these plans, some of which, such as this pipeline, have been on the drawing board for decades. And it's perhaps the corridor that gives finances a kick towards funding. Djibouti Addis also kind of goes off both to the north and south, but has become a really thick infrastructural corridor in which a series of different investments are bundled onto and through these cities. So I'm just going to talk through the northern corridor a little more, thinking about the infrastructure that make up this corridor and the ways in which we might think about breaking them down and think about them in more detail. So here you can see some of the data points that make up each of these infrastructure investments. The data that we've collected is based around individual investments, or what we call components. And you can see each of these components are able to be broken down further and further. So we've generated as much detail and data as we can, thinking about finance, the companies involved, the aims and objectives, timelines, the different organizations involved. Mombasa Port, second terminal, phase 1. So there's always a series of different overlapping projects. We've incorporated thinking about the costs. We're interested in what new technological capacities are involved. We're particularly interested in the finances involved. So here you can see in Mombasa, unlike the story we're normally given of East Africa, that it's actually the Japanese Cooperation Agency involved in its financing and expansion. The standard gauge railway phase 1 in Kenya, built through a Chinese Exim Bank loan, built by the China Road and Bridge Corporation, and currently finishing in Naivasha, a dry inland port. The Gulu logistics hub, which sits a long way from anywhere, is only valued at 29 million. So not a prominent infrastructure investment in the database, but an integral part of the broader plan of the Northern Corridor, and particularly its expansion into South Sudan. And I think when we get down to the level of thinking about the urban space of the corridor, even a small investment of 29 million in Gulu can have really interesting dynamics coming out of it for social scientists thinking about the impact of these investments. So what are we learning out of the database? Still quite a lot that we need to test and test again. But I think particularly in thinking about East Africa, we can demonstrate a massive surge of infrastructure investment in the last 15 years, tied to but exceeding the BRI. And I think this is noticeable given previous decades of huge underinvestment in infrastructure systems, particularly driven by structural adjustment programs. For the Northern Corridor alone, we document $34 billion of investment, and we can see a whole range of different infrastructures across diverse territories. Some of these are entirely new and shiny projects. A lot of them are rehabilitations of decaying infrastructure. Alongside this surge, we can see new financing arrangements emerging alongside existing mechanisms. Most prominently, at least in the media coverage in the region, is the Chinese Exim Bank. But there's also a story of new national investment capacities by governments such as Kenya and Uganda that are investing in the infrastructure themselves. There's existing funders like the World Bank that still remain around, assertive regional development banks that are now have the capacity to lend at scale, and then new private finance coming from various directions. And we can see this in particular sectors such as real estate. Now, there is a significant presence of Chinese contractors in and on the Northern Corridor, but what we also document is a range of other state-owned enterprises, as well as private contractors from Turkey, Spain, Italy, and then local contractors. Finally, construction is often, but not always, connected to financing arrangements. So a Japanese loan or grant to the Mombasa Port Authority comes with certain conditions to use a Japanese construction company, the Toa Corporation. The Chinese Exim Bank loan for the standard gauge railway comes with some conditionalities around using China Road and Bridge Corporation. So an increasing pattern of we'll lend you the money, but only if you use one of our state construction companies. So there might also be a particular trend about how particular funders are tied to particular kinds or forms of infrastructure. We see that the World Bank and to a lesser extent the EU are really happy to carry on funding road building and rehabilitation programs. Most, but not all, new railway projects seem to be pushed through Chinese finance mechanisms, and then private finance, both from the region itself, but also places such as the Gulf, are driving real estate investments. So I think going back to those maps that we showed you for the Atlas, we can see the network dimensions of corridors and the way in which they bundle different technologies together. So it's a way of representing in a symbolic way a kind of vision of the future of the region and the states within it. It leads us to question what is official or direct investment in the corridor and what is perhaps more unofficial and indirect. How do we classify the kinds of infrastructures and investments that are going into the corridor? Some of the corridors, including the Northern Corridor, have an official authority but should we think about the corridor and its investments in a wider sense, a kind of force that brings new kinds of investments in? And then the integral role of the port. So all of the corridors that I've been through in East Africa, and indeed many in the database, have an integral role of one port that is the locus of significant expansion. Here we can think about how the corridor is predicated on a port destination as its logistical start and end point. So they're the global spaces of the corridor that become regionalized and have a kind of broader force or process that's reshaping the world. The third line of inquiry, beyond the temporal and the global space, in thinking about this developing theoretical orientation of corridor urbanization, is to focus on the technological or the infrastructural components that constitute the corridor. The starting point from the technologies that become bundled together to form these broader multi-modal networks. So you've seen me mention time and again these different kinds of infrastructure. You've seen on the maps themselves the way in which all these different infrastructures come together. And in the data collection for the Atlas, we identified a whole series of different infrastructures that constitute the corridor. While our list is not exclusive, I think it shows the main and various components or elements that collectively form these multimodal initiatives. If you're thinking of building your own corridor, I'm providing here a list of key infrastructural ingredients for your recipe. You can throw in a railroad, a road, a port, a zone, a waterway, a hinterlands, an enclave, various kinds of extraction and power activities, and a digital connection. And there we have the corridor. So I want to go through them in a little more detail, drawing from the case study sites we've developed with our partners on the project, British Institute in East Africa, Karachi Urban Lab, Crete University, and others. And whilst I'll just be going through them briefly today, there'll be some more details about these projects and others in our dialogue with the wider team in the final Sheffield Urbanism event. So ports are integral, as I've mentioned, to the broader corridor. They operate at the interface between the territory that the corridor is planned through and the maritime networks of global trade, production, and logistical circulation. In Pakistan, a series of issues swirl around its port futures. You can see here 3 of Pakistan's primary ports, 2 of which lay along the mainline road, mainline 1 railway corridor, and 1 of them, Gwadar, is envisaged along the new CPET corridor. But they all have their own contradictions and tensions about how they might expand in order to engage with the corridorization logic. Karachi Port, in the massive city of Karachi, is severely restrained in its future expansion plans. It currently has a 12-berth operation, but given its 6 proximate to Jackson's Market, massive informal settlements such as Matchar, its capacity to expand and increase its handling of around 60% of the nation's cargo remains a real problem. Problem of logistical connection, but also intermodality. How you get freight out from the port through 25 million people in the city is an issue that has been driving Karachi Port Authority to think about various solutions. At the moment, though, some of the Karachi Port Trust land is now being re-envisaged, not through its logistical purpose, but as a potential massive BRI-led urban reclamation project into the water known as the Karachi Comprehensive Coastal Development Zone. Work being undertaken by SANA and SOBI is informing us much more about this plan. And so the port may not expand, but shift into a secondary circuit of capital, thinking about real estate. This is unlike Port Qasim, also in the Karachi area, but in a different part of the area towards its periphery. It's built right on the edge as an industrial zone. It's incredibly successful in Pakistan. in that there's over 400 operations on site. The port was operated by P&O from the 1990s, which itself was bought out by DP World from 2006. So Port Qasim has great connectivity, it has great logistical operations, but it can't be part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor because it's actually owned by a rival state through DP World. So you can begin to see that it's not just the logistical, material, or spatial constraints around the port that might be constraining its expansion or inclusion along particular corridors. And there, of course, is an expansion plan for Qasim involving a $2 billion zone. Finally, and perhaps most interestingly in terms of thinking about corridors, is the Gwadar port, part of Balochistan, originally built under President Musharraf, but now part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. A huge investment in the port itself through the China Overseas Port Holding Company, and a whole series of other investments, including airports, zones, and real estate speculations. At the moment, the port has no train connection. Estimated cost to China, $58 billion. It's not able to drive freight out of the port up to Karachi and then onto the rail line there because of the insurgency in Balochistan. So the port, although designed as a new massive part of an infrastructure corridor, has currently one ship a year passing through it. And at the same time, you can begin to see some of the urban dimensions to these infrastructural spaces, potential displacement of urban dwellers, and bigger issues of insecurity across the province. So you can see here in Pakistan's port paradox, a range of issues about this infrastructural space. Railways are perhaps the next most critical ingredient in our recipe for the corridor. Our database has shown tens of billions of investments spilling into new and rehabilitated railway projects that often form the backbone of corridor initiatives. Some is directly connected to large extractive projects, particularly in West and Central Africa, and others alongside road projects as connectivity initiatives into hinterlands. And Tawheed from the Karachi Urban Lab will explain a bit more about some of the urban displacement pressures around the rehabilitation and upgrading of this line next week. The standard gauge railway in Kenya is another classic railway corridor railway built through a Chinese loan, not completely built in its full plan, at least up to now. And we can see here how the SGR in the Kenyan state is also integral to the wider Northern Corridor and its regional investments in SGR. So Uganda will only move forward with its SGR investment if it knows that it can connect at the border. South Sudan will only invest in its SGR railway future if it knows it can connect to Uganda. So these plans are always taking place in both a national but also regional context when it comes to the railways. We've looked at various kinds of road projects. Here you can see a road within a city, the Nairobi Expressway, which Warumi will be talking about more next week, and which Prince and colleagues have written about as a kind of plug-in urbanism. It's both an integral part of the Northern Corridor by allowing people to bypass the dense, traffic-congested streets of the city, but it also has an urban logic in that it helps rich people get to the airport. So zones often form an integral part of a corridor. They're critical to the corridorization logic, particularly the planning of special economic zones, because they have a promise of increasing manufacturing-led transformation over economies, particularly those that have either deindustrialized or that have never fulfilled their industrial potential. Given the Chinese success, which I mentioned last week, around these zones, as well as the surge of finance and investment emanating from China through the BRI, it's little surprise that many countries have attempted to follow this approach in bolstering manufacturing capacity. As Song and colleagues argue, the development of overseas industrial parks is a key component of the BRI and an expected experimental way of promoting globalization by inventing new forms of cooperation between China and local host countries. The Alami Iqbal Industrial City, being researched by AMNA, is a really good example of a zone that's part of a broader corridor. It's been relatively successful in that it's attracted some Chinese businesses. Here you can see the ubiquitous gates of special economic zones that you can see as a globally replicable product across the planet. But they're not the only kind of zones that we can see. In work that Yanis has been doing around the Triasso Logistics Centre, you can see the infrastructural space of the zone as being less shaped around manufacturing and industrial capacity and more as logistical spaces that seek to produce and intensify multimodality upon which the wider corridor rests. Interestingly, these are not always successful. If you visit the Triasso zone today, you'll see a beautiful assemblage of infrastructures, railway control towers, railways, but you won't hear or see much traffic. Indeed, when we visited there earlier last year, the only noise you could hear in and around the zone was that of the farmers' local horses. So these zones can be more or less speculative. They can be more or less logistical or industrial, but they're really integral to our recipe of the corridor. Real estate enclaves and real estate projects are often indirect investments that sit along corridors, tying into the new investments, particularly in transit, but without a logistical purpose. Rather, we can think more about how private finance, or in the case of Kenya, the state itself through Konza, use ideas of corridorization logics, connectivity, kind of my city's the next global hub, to attract both domestic and international capital to build these vast new urban developments, many of which are on site and being delivered and are not just these kind of speculative visions. And there's a range of ways in which we can think about the financing of these real estate projects in and through the corridor. Fatima has particularly been looking at the way in which small-scale investors from the UK have been building the Lahore Smart City. We can think about large domestic finance, such as in the Lincoln case in Athens, in which a large developer, Lamna Development, is funding or front funding the case itself. Then we can look at the Karachi Comprehensive Coastal Development Zone, in which the Chinese seek to build the construction themselves. In our recipe, we should add extractive activities. Many corridors that we're documenting are actually built out of new extractive zones, particularly in West, Central, and into Eastern Africa. Here you can see the ECOP, a huge new oil pipeline connecting Western Uganda to the port of Tanga in Tanzania. It's a multi-billion-dollar project in extraction, and it involves both European and Chinese partners operating together, which I think, again, going back to these trends we're pulling out in our database, is very interesting. And as Leah on our project has been pursuing, the construction of these vast extractive projects often comes with significant social costs. And Leah's been documenting the displacements, particularly in Western Uganda, to make way for this corridor project. We'll be dropping a report in early 2025 on that one. Power and power generation, power distribution are really important in thinking about corridors. A lot of initiatives are very much built now along distribution lines of rail and road routes that follow corridors. In Pakistan, Atufa has been building on long-standing work by the Karachi Urban Lab in the Tarparka district, thinking about how new power investments in the coal sector involving Pakistan and Chinese finance have utterly transformed the hinterland towns of Mithi and Islamkot. Social costs like with the extractions in the ECOP, are significant and require new ways to think about these infrastructural spaces. But along the corridor, it's not just these carbon-intensive investments. In Crete, Harrow and Janis have been looking at the investment of new cables to connect Crete to the mainland, a new power corridor that has led to and produced the proliferation of renewable energy projects on the island, particularly around wind, and many of which have been claimed have little benefit for local lives. Finally, for your recipe, you can throw in some digital, the rise of digital corridors tied to the digital Silk Road, the integration of the world economy into digital circuits, the growth of the Second Cold War and the rivalry over network centrality has led to a growing proliferation along corridors of data centers and other kind of digital spaces. And these infrastructural spaces are really interesting in that they're both opaque and black box, but also very visible in their energy intensive demands and critical to various forms of connectivity and circulation. So part D, we've looked at the temporality or time of the corridor. We've looked at the global space of these initiatives. I've briefly been through the infrastructural spaces they produce. And our final line of inquiry that helps to develop our theoretical orientation around corridor urbanisation is to think specifically through the urban geographies of these initiatives to ground these really big and somewhat abstract, generic, globally replicable products into the towns and cities that sit along their routes. To do so involves another set of considerations about what this means. We can think about what kind of theoretical vocabularies and methodological strategies we need to investigate the urban geographies of the corridor. May we require new explanatory frameworks and methods to think through the corridorization logics, but also the stories that come out along the corridor, particularly given their scale and size. Where do we start our investigations about the urban geographies of a corridor? Is it in the middle of a corridor? Is it at a port? Where are our lines of inquiry within these corridors that we might take up research and think about what a corridor means to urban lives? What kind of research themes can we pursue that we can bundle together? In the last lecture, I drew on our in-print urban studies paper to suggest 4 themes: politics and social relations planning, space and territory, and technology. And I'll go back to these shortly. And I think probably the biggest tension for the project is how we might bring together the whole of the corridor with the fragments that exist across these urban geographies. What can we do to account for the messiness and non-linearity and network nature of these corridors? Can we ever develop a systemic knowledge of them? Or do we have to recognize this will only always be partial, again, given their scale and size? Again, going back to the question of where do we start and where do we finish? Today, I've started in a broadly scale away from the global down to the urban, but maybe we could start from the everyday, from the local, in pursuing these kinds of investigations. So I'm now going to go into a little more depth so that I'm less abstract and more into the places that we've been doing research. 2 case studies that show how this line of inquiry around urban geographies and urban spaces of the corridor itself incorporates multiple different foci, how we need to keep hold of a host of different conceptual and empirical starting points when thinking about the corridorization project at play. So in work developed with Yanis and Seth, we're looking at how the Athens metropolitan area might be reordered through corridorization logics and a series of investments into infrastructure that have surged into the region in recent years. And if you're in the room, you can just see down here, you have the Maritime Silk Road and IMEC ocean route into Piraeus Port. You have new logistics centre being developed by Hig Capital with a range of other investments. In the far north, you have the shipyards, and then on the western side, you have a series of LNG gas investments that have been proliferating in recent times. The story starts with what is now a highly visible element of China's BRI and its engagement with Europe. In May 2016, a controlling stake in the state-owned port of Piraeus was sold by the Greek government in a deal for over 300 million euros. The sell-off was facilitated through Greece's privatization agency as part of imposed conditions for a Eurozone structural adjustment of the supposedly crisis-hit country. The 50-year lease to the Chinese COSCO shipping company is part of plans for the southern Mediterranean port to act as a European gateway to the Maritime Silk Road, which is the oceanic route of the BRI. Large-scale opposition to the sale of this site was driven by the Union of Dock Workers, including through strike action, but was ultimately unsuccessful. The port, its future, is being reimagined as a high-tech enclave of global logistics and associated real estate investment. It's been crucial to the Chinese ambitions to the Maritime Silk Road and has been termed the Dragon's Head by the Chinese president, denoting its importance in creating a logistical base or landing space through which Chinese corridorization logics could be extended into Europe, specifically the Balkans, and perhaps as part of or expanding upon the existing EU-led TEN-T network. So since then, the Chinese and specifically COSCO have attempted to extend their operations in multiple spaces across Athens from the port itself, but so far without success. The Elefsina shipyards were initially rumoured to be a site for COSCO expansion, but this is where the story gets interesting. A US firm has also been active in logistical investment in Greece. The local subsidiary of a New York-based Onyx Technologies followed up a shipyard investment in another part of Greece with the purchase here of the Elefsina shipyards, and it did so with the backing of the US government. And I don't just mean it was supported by, but was directly financially backed by. So Onyx, valued at around 250 million, and the US International Development Finance Corporation provided $125 million loan. The DFC, as it's called, was itself set up in 2019 as a federal agency out of the Better Utilization of Investment Leading to Development Build Act, with the explicit intention of acting as the counterweight to the BRI. DFC CEO Scott Nathan heralded the deal by suggesting, quote, the DFC's investment in the Elefsina shipyard will develop a maritime and energy supply hub that will create good local jobs here in Greece and help the country and region become less reliant on Russian energy. And this support seems to have gone beyond the loan. It was reported by the publication Tradewinds that the US government pushed the Greek government to ensure the deal went through. The maintenance and repair operations of the shipyard includes work on various different types of vessels. However, they're particularly orientated to LNG tankers coming and going from the nearby terminal, as well as potential military uses into the future. A few years ago, Chinese state-owned enterprises were potentially interested in this facility, but the US government and a US corporation have ensured that this now lies within US interests. We can think a little more about the area just around the coast from the shipyards. In 2022, Hig Capital, a global alternative investment firm headquartered in Miami with up to 60 billion of funds under its control, purchased a former steel mill in Aspropyrgos through its local subsidiary Stream. Higg Capital intends to construct a 150,000 square metre storage facility connected to a railway line and proposed pier to ocean-going ships. The acquisition heralded a further burst of investment of around $250 million in Greece and further afield, with the aim, we think, of creating a corridor to Central Europe and the Balkans for the flow of consumer goods and other kinds of cargo. The strategies involved a relatively rapid acquisition of a series of distinct interlocking Greek companies involved in the logistics centre. So Higg Capital Stream now owns 70% of Olympias Transport, which itself has got logistical spaces in Asproprigos. It has ownership of Makios Logistics with new facilities near the Thriasso logistics zone that I previously mentioned. However, its most significant investment is a 80% majority stake in Greece's largest transportation and logistics company, Orpheus. Like the former steel mill, the company is also based in Asproprigos, and the purchase has given Higg Capital a reported 18% share of the national logistics market. So overall, these acquisitions have helped Higg Capital to integrate a series of long-standing Greek operators, including other companies, into a massive new logistical arrangement or corridor with estimated turnover of over 350 million euros and 2,500 employees. Furthermore, these Greek investments complement further purchases of storage and transportation facilities in the Western Balkans, Bulgaria, Romania, Germany, providing the capacity to offer shipping companies and other operators a seamless corridor into and through Europe. So, brief, but what I've hoped to tell here is how urban space is being reshaped through the geopolitics playing out across Athens' investment in infrastructure and the making or attempted making of various corridors. So as Calder argues, a clear example Piraeus is of Chinese investments that can lay the basis for greater future influence corresponding to China's changing geo-economic needs is the port of Piraeus. And here we can think back again to Seth's work with others on the spatial logic of the Second Cold War and really see how this is playing out an intense geopolitics of connectivity at a metropolitan or urban scale. This isn't some global abstract race that's happening, but it's reordering, reshaping, and transforming urban space. So if we go back to the 4 themes that we proposed in our urban studies paper, we can think about the planning aspects and how metropolitan area of Athens is being planned around the imperatives of intermodality and connectivity. We can think about, from a political sense, how the area or metropolitan area has become a hotspot of the Second Cold War. It's not just the Dragon's Head and the Costco investment, but the emerging US response. We can think about the range of local resistance and contestation and labor regimes that play and swirl around these investments. We can think from a space and territory perspective about the re-emergence of Athens as a critical locus of activity in the Mediterranean via the Maritime Silk Road. We can think about the ways in which new corridors or their planning are playing out across the city and its life. Technologically, there's lots of different ingredients that we could jump into to tell this story: ports, railways, roads, zones, energy investments, and others. So I'm now going to return to my most familiar corridor, the Northern Corridor, and a series of investments in Eastern Uganda that allow me to suggest a more grounded and situated analysis, thinking about urban space of corridors, one that contends with the inhabitations in everyday lives that are being transformed through the corridorization logic. And this is work that I've done with Sydney in Mbale. So if we look at this corridor, Mbale lies on the Kenyan border, just some way north of Lake Victoria. There's a series of investments, and I'll focus on two today. Firstly, the Uganda Railway Northern Spur, a branch line extending 382 kilometres from Tororo, located on a railway junction between Kenya and Uganda. The railway itself is initially built in the 20s as a speculative cotton line as part of the wider Uganda Railway, lobbied for by both leading figures in the Protectorate and the cotton industry lobby in Britain, seeking new frontiers for agricultural growth, particularly the British Cotton Growers Association, based in Manchester, down the road. So I won't talk too much today, although I'd like to, about this history of the railway and its kind of cotton connections. But the railway itself extends out of Tororo, but has been out of operation since the 1990s, reflecting both the broader stagnation of the Ugandan economy and particularly the effects of public disinvestment precipitated again by the structural adjustment program imposed by the World Bank and IMF in the 80s and 90s. So here we see a regime of disinvestment, including a privatisation concession to Rift Valley Railway, that do nothing or little to improve the railway. So given the investment by Kenya in the standard gauge railway, Uganda has a new interest in railway connections as part of the Northern Corridor. The rehabilitation and upgrading of this line was originally meant to be financed by the European Union, not the Chinese. So I think this is again important to mention. But the financing arrangement collapsed after the French contractor pulled out of the contracting, citing non-payment by the Ugandan government. After a period of uncertainty, the Ugandan government stepped forward itself to invest around $53 million. The contract's awarded to the China Roads and Bridge Corporation, who already have a great record of building the standard gauge railway over the border in Kenya. And the underlying logistical function of the upgrade is to connect these northern and eastern Uganda towns, and particularly up to the Gulu Logistical Centre, which I mentioned, is self-funded through $29 million of money from the EU and the UK. In recent years, the establishment of the nearby industrial park has preceded a peace in Mbale. The park was leased by the Ugandan Investment Authority to the Tintang Group as part of a broader process at developing zones, special economic zones in Uganda that I've already mentioned. Zheng Li and Tom have examined Goodfellow have examined much of the industrial park development in Uganda and nearby Ethiopia, and they suggest these projects are often improvised. And you can see that here with the Tintang Group as a non-state-owned enterprise, but rather a local Chinese-orientated business that's been in Uganda for over 20 years. The park itself is massive. It's been very successful in terms of attracting 37 new factory operations on site. I'll come back to shortly that the industrial park required 864 households to be moved or relocated, and the land has been leased for 49 years. There's various media reports that suggest this could be as low as $5 per year per acre. Further infrastructure works have been designed to deal with issues around energy, water, and transit. And the aim of the park, according to the president, is to build Uganda's industrial and manufacturing capacity and to develop that within the country itself. So they're the two projects that make up this tiny part of the Northern Corridor. And I think when Sydney and I first approached the construction sites around the railway outside the town of Tororo, we saw that the spot was busy with a team of labourers working under a local private contractor. Their job was to build a drainage system along the yet-to-be relayed track that would, when complete, alter the flows of rainwater into nearby wetlands. We saw large stones being quarried from nearby hills that were being broken up by a separate set of workers. Other workers were taking these stones and using them with new rock brand cement that had come in 50-kilogram bags from one of the local factories. Further away, workers were digging away at the embankment, whilst a large yellow compactor was flattening the surface, creating a new alignment that had cut through the bright red earth. Local youth were also busy ferrying buckets of water to the men mixing the cement, receiving some well-received shillings later from the foreman. Nearby, where we stood listening to the engineer, the hat with the initials CRBC, denoting the involvement of China Railway and Bridge Corporation, lay on the tracks. A joint inspection team made up of Ugandan and Chinese engineers inspected the following week, making sure the quality of the work had been complete. Meanwhile, as we sat talking with the engineer, food had just arrived from a local kitchen, heralding a quick break in the lunchtime for matoke and rice. Along this railway line, we can see that all kinds of things were in movement and motion. We noticed this first as a political ecological condition of moved and flattened earth, excavated quarry stone, factory transported cement, and imported railway sleepers that were required for this project. However, we were soon struck by how this state of flux extended from the immediate materialities of construction and were noticeable among people, such as labourers toiling away at the weekends. Households shifted out the way, ecologies such as new hydrological dynamics of adjacent streams, financing such as contracts with Chinese and local firms, as well as the promise of new agricultural products of cotton or imported grain being involved in accelerated circulation through the railway line. Everything as such was up in the air, uncertain, different from before, with nobody quite sure of how things were going to land. We got a profound sense of the need to think about these corridor projects beyond a relatively technical understanding. Rather, we were struck by how all kinds of things were becoming unsettled. Now, we don't have time to go into depth about how this idea of unsettlement might be used to think about a more everyday or inhabited form of urban space on the corridor. The idea draws extensively on Abdul Malik Simone's work, thinking through unsettlement or unsettling. And Sydney and I, in our paper, are trying to think through unsettlement of people, particularly the local villages that were relocated, displaced, and some of the experiences they've had, and the forms of unsettlement that continue to permeate their life in these resettlement villages. Here you can see testimonies of how little compensation was given to them, some of the struggles that they subsequently have had to face, given such little attempt by the government or the state to re-establish the communities in which they live. And here you can see the satellite imagery of the displacement and replacement with the industrial park. Sydney and I spoke to these community leaders. It was profoundly depressing, and there's a range of testimonies that really, I think, get to the heart of this feeling of being unsettled by corridor projects and the kind of issues that they're facing. But it wasn't just people that were being unsettled. It wasn't just the people being displaced, indeed, that were unsettled. We saw new Chinese migrants coming into the town and the cultural lives that were forming around it, and all kinds of other forms of unsettlement that were peopled. But we also had a profound sense of the unsettlement of ecologies. The industrial park was getting a bit worried about water permeating the site and decided to go ahead and build a drainage channel. When I heard about this, I thought it was a little stream just winding its way through, but here you can see massive earthworks that threaten to collapse the surrounding village and have created an impenetrable barrier. Local politicians have been active, and although the works have stopped now, you could really see here the kind of unsettlement as an ecological process, as well as the kind of materialities put into and built along the railway. We can think economically about unsettlement, and I love this response from a local politician who asked who I was and what I was doing. I told him I was from a British university, and he told me, what are you doing here? The British influence is minimal nowadays. China is a rising superpower. I think that the work in Eastern Uganda shows these economies at play at an urban scale. I visited with Sydney, one textile production centre in the zone, based from Sichuan, and now with 500 workers on site producing clothes in Uganda for Ugandan, alongside national legislation hoping to cut down second-hand clothes. But you could also see and hear a range of issues around labour rights and working in Chinese factories, the new kind of economic aspirations for the town in terms of the scale of employment that the zone will bring about, as well as my favourite subject, which again I will censor myself from today, around the cotton economies in and around the town that may be reconstituted through these new investments. So I hope that I've just given a brief reflection or attempt to offer or show some of the work we're doing, in this case around an everyday situated analysis focused on unsettlement, one that thinks about the urban space of the corridor at the scale of the household or the displaced community, one that takes a kind of concept and tries to run with it in lots of different ways, and is profoundly and quite different than the mode of analysis taking place through our work in Athens. But again, referring back to our urban studies paper is a way to think through what kinds of research themes might be drawn out of thinking about the corridor as an urban space in Mbale, around planning, social and political relations, space and territory, and technology. So, nearly finished. Today, I've attempted at least to build on the previous lecture, which sought to centre the corridor historically in broader patterns of urbanisation that go far back into the histories of trade, technology and urban settlements, the genealogy of the term itself and the urban implications that emerge across its proliferating use in urban studies and planning. I've suggested we can think about how various lines of inquiry might constitute today a theoretical orientation around the loose idea of corridor urbanisation. At this stage, and likely as the Global Corridor Project continues, this idea of corridor urbanisation is likely to remain necessarily open and expansive, loose and flexible, as the corridor itself remains elusive and ever-present, multi-scalar and operating across different temporalities. There can be no singular way in which to engage these initiatives. What I've hoped to offer today and in the previous lecture is to develop an orientation, a research agenda, a set of emerging data and conceptual, empirical and methodological strategies that might help us to further pursue these techno-territorial transformations on a transforming planet. And today they've involved thinking about the time of the corridor, the global space of the corridor, the infrastructural space of the corridor, and the urban space of the corridor. That's all for today. I hope you can make our online meeting with our partners in the project in a couple of weeks, in which we'll be having a dialogue about the global urbanisms of the corridor and hearing from some really fantastic people. Thank you very much.